The restaurant was the kind of place where chandeliers hung like crowns, where servers moved silently between tables carrying silver trays, and where power seemed to hum beneath the polished marble floors. Guests dined in tailored suits and designer dresses, their voices lowered as if the walls themselves demanded discretion. In that room, wealth wasn't just displayed, it was expected. At the center table sat a man who embodied that expectation. A billionaire CEO, known for his deals that stretched across continents, leaned back in his chair, surrounded by associates who treated his words like law. His watch caught the glow of the lights each time he lifted his hand, a silent reminder of just how much he owned. For him, this wasn't dinner. This was theater. And everyone in that dining hall, from guests to staff, were his audience. Into this room walked a young waitress, balancing her tray with the steady poise of someone who had learned how to hide nerves behind a straight back. She had been working double shifts for months, helping her mother pay rent, setting aside scraps for her own education. She wasn't supposed to be remarkable. She was there to serve, to clear plates, to remain unseen. But the moment she placed a glass of water at his table, she was no longer invisible. The CEO's voice cut through the room, sharp enough to silence a dozen conversations. He looked up at her with a smirk that carried no warmth, and with a single word, spat out like it tasted foul, he shattered the fragile balance of the evening. Stupid. The insult hung in the air. Guests froze mid-bite. Forks clinked against plates. A cough in the corner died abruptly. She stood still, the tray trembling ever so slightly in her hand. The word had been thrown with such ease, as though her worth could be reduced to nothing more than a careless insult. His associates laughed lightly, not because it was funny, but because laughter was the safest choice when their fortunes relied on his favor. The sound was thin, nervous. The waitress didn't answer. Her lips pressed together, her chin lifted a fraction of an inch higher. She wasn't giving him the reaction he wanted, and that only deepened his sneer. It wasn't the first time he had spoken that way to someone. To him, titles and money justified arrogance. But this moment was different. Every eye in the restaurant was locked on him, waiting. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. A man by the window lowered his phone slightly, angling it just enough for the camera to catch the exchange. The waitress swallowed hard, but her silence carried more weight than his insult. She stood rooted, shoulders squared, as if daring the ground not to swallow her dignity. And in that heavy silence, it became clear. She wasn't the only one being measured that night. Because at that very table, beyond the empty wine glasses and half-finished entrees, sat the seeds of a deal worth millions of dollars, lion dollars. A partnership he had been nurturing for months, one that promised to expand his empire. He thought nothing could touch him here. Not in this place, not with this much money on the line. He was wrong. The guests watching, the staff holding their breath, the man recording quietly from across the room, they were about to witness the moment arrogance toppled power. The waitress he dismissed as stupid wasn't just any waitress. She was about to become the face of a story that would spread far beyond the walls of that glittering dining room. And as the CEO raised his glass, smug in belief that the night still belonged to him, he had no idea that the next few hours would cost him everything he thought was untouchable. Quick note before we go further. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss powerful true stories like this one. And drop a comment letting us know what country you're watching from. I always love seeing where our community is tuning in. Back in that restaurant, the silence had shifted. No one said a word, yet the atmosphere carried something sharp, unspoken. The insult might have seemed small, just a passing word from a man used to dominance. But people were watching. Phones were ready. And consequences, though invisible for now, were already gathering at the edges of the night. The waitress steadied her tray, her eyes fixed on a point just above his shoulder, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her gaze. The CEO leaned back, satisfied, as if nothing more needed to be said. But the night wasn't over, because in the very next moment, someone at a nearby table pushed back their chair, stood up, and changed everything. Her name tag read small, almost unnoticeable, but the weight of her life was larger than anyone at that table could have guessed. She was 21, balancing trays by day and textbooks by night. College was never meant to be a luxury for her, it was survival. Every tip she pocketed went toward tuition. Every double shift paid for a portion of her mother's medical bills, Every late night of studying fueled the hope that one day she'd no longer be serving food in silence. She carried herself with the quiet endurance of someone who had learned early that dignity doesn't come from circumstance, but from how you face it. Even when exhaustion lined her eyes, her smile for guests remained genuine. She wasn't simply working tables, she was holding her family together in the cracks left by a system that had rarely offered her mercy. Yet in that dining room, none of that mattered to the man who now sat smirking at her. To him, she was nothing more than a body in an apron, a servant meant to keep his wine filled and his ego fed. This man had been called brilliant in business magazines, ruthless in shareholder meetings, and unstoppable in negotiations. His empire stretched across industries, airlines, hotels, tech startups, even sports teams. But beneath the polished headlines lay a reputation that whispered through corporate halls, arrogance that matched his wealth, and an intolerance for anyone who dared to exist outside his carefully curated circle of power. He lived in a world where yes was the only word he expected, where staff were invisible until they made a mistake, and where women like her, young, black, working class, were easy targets for the kind of cruelty that he believed proved dominance. She knew men like him, not by name, but by pattern. The way their eyes slid past her, as though she were part of the furniture. The way their voices sharpened when her presence interrupted their illusion of control. And most of all, the way they assumed her silence was agreement. But her silence was something else entirely. When he called her stupid, she did not crumble. She steadied the tray against her hip, pressing her fingers into the edge to stop the trembling. Inside, the word pierced like glass, but on the surface she gave him nothing. That restraint, that refusal to meet hate with apology, was her form of defiance. The CEO saw only obedience in her lack of response, but others saw more. They saw her spine straighten, her chin lift, and her decision not to bow. In a room carved by wealth and whiteness, her presence became more than service, it became a mirror. This wasn't just a clash between a diner and a server. It was a collision of class and race, of privilege against perseverance. He had walked into that restaurant believing the world bent to his signature and his bank account. She had walked in with nothing but resilience stitched into her every step. The contrast was glaring. He had the luxury of power, the kind that silenced boardrooms, shifted markets, and bent entire companies to his will. She had the resilience of survival, the kind that kept her on her feet through insults, through exhaustion, through the weight of responsibility that should never have been hers alone. As his laughter echoed, shallow and cruel, she forced herself to breathe evenly. Because she knew one truth he would never understand: respect could never be bought, and dignity could never be taken by force. The associates around him clung to their laughter, thin and shaky, while the rest of the dining room simmered in unease. Wealth insulated him from the shame of the moment, but it could not insulate him from the eyes watching. Somewhere near the back, another server caught her gaze for a split second. No words passed between them, but in that moment, solidarity was clear. She wasn't alone, even if he wanted her to feel that way. And for the first time that night, a crack appeared in the CEO's aura of untouchability. Not because he had been challenged with words, but because he was being challenged by something he didn't know how to fight. Her restraint, her composure, her refusal to validate his insult. She brought plates to the table. He brought prejudice. And the clash of those two truths was about to ignite a fire larger than either of them could control. The next round of service came with heavier footsteps than before. She carried fresh plates, seared salmon glazed in citrus, a cut of steak nearly dripping with butter, and lowered them carefully onto the CEO's table. Her movements were practiced, steady. But the air at that table carried the weight of the insult still hanging between them. He barely looked up. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, he gestured toward the glass of wine she had poured earlier. "This isn't the vintage I asked for," he barked, though it was exactly the bottle he had ordered. She hesitated, not long enough to disrespect him, but long enough to weigh her words. "Sir, it's the reserve from..." He cut her off with a laugh so sharp it pierced the murmur of the dining room. "Don't try to explain, just bring the right one this time. Honestly, is this so difficult for you?" Conversations at nearby tables stuttered to silence again. The clink of silverware, the low hum of background chatter, all of it died under the sound of his voice. Diners shifted in their seats, eyes darting from their plates to the scene unfolding before them. She steadied the tray against her palm. Her jaw tightened, but her lips stayed closed. The urge to defend herself pressed against her chest, but she knew the danger of words when they came from someone like her to someone like him. "Unbelievable," he scoffed, turning to his companions. "You'd think even the simplest tasks could be managed. And yet, here we are, wasting time." One of his associates forced a chuckle, eyes fixed on the tablecloth. Another sipped nervously at his water, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The sound of false laughter mixed with silence made the room colder than any insult alone. The waitress swallowed hard. The sting in her throat was sharp, her vision tightening as tears threatened to rise. But she didn't let them fall. Not here. Not in front of him. Instead, she lifted the empty bottle smoothly from the table, tucked it onto her tray, and gave a nod that was neither submissive nor confrontational, simply resolute. Her hands moved with calm grace, even as her chest ached with the weight of humiliation. Around her, diners exchanged glances. Some frowned, some shifted uncomfortably, and some lowered their eyes, unwilling to involve themselves. Silence was safer. Silence cost nothing. But silence also meant complicity. The CEO leaned back, stretching an arm across the back of his chair, smugness radiating from every angle of his posture. "This is why standards matter," he declared to his companions, though loud enough for half the room to hear. "People like this are why excellence is rare." The words struck deeper than the insult itself. People like this. Not a mistake, not a slip, an entire judgment of her existence, her race, her very presence in that room. She felt it like a weight pressing down on her chest. But still she stood. No outburst, no surrender, just quiet resilience. From the far corner of the restaurant, a couple exchanged whispers. Another diner's phone tilted slightly, camera capturing the unfolding spectacle. The staff at the back lingered longer than usual by the kitchen doors, torn between stepping in and knowing the risks of challenging power that wealthy. Her body screamed to walk away, but her pride forced her to return with the second bottle. She poured without trembling, though her pulse thundered beneath her skin. He smirked as if her silence proved his point. "Finally," he muttered, raising the glass. "Even she can manage it eventually." Her hand tightened around the neck of the bottle, but she didn't speak. She simply placed it back on the tray, straightened her shoulders, and stepped back. And in that moment, the dining room wasn't listening to him. They were watching her, watching how she bore the humiliation without breaking. Humiliation is loud. Dignity, however, whispers, and everyone heard it. The CEO thought he had won. He thought the insult had ended at that table. But what he didn't see were the eyes still watching, the phone recording, and the current of outrage that was already beginning to stir quietly among strangers. The waitress walked away with her tray held high, her dignity intact. He leaned back in triumph, not realizing he had just set the stage for the moment that would strip him of far more than he could ever imagine. The dining room never fully returned to normal after that exchange. Plates were cleared, courses continued, but the tension lingered like smoke. What the CEO dismissed as a throwaway insult didn't vanish into the clatter of cutlery. It lingered, captured, and waiting to be amplified. At a corner table, a man who had been pretending to scroll through his phone quietly saved the video he had been recording. He wasn't looking for drama that night. He hadn't even intended to pull his phone out. But when the insult rang across the restaurant, something inside him refused to let it slide into silence. With one quick tap, the moment was no longer confined to those marble walls. It was free to move, to spread, to be witnessed by millions. By the time the waitress returned to the kitchen, fighting back the sting of humiliation, the first clip was already online. Captions flooded the screen. "Billionaire CEO mocks waitress in luxury hotel restaurant." The words were paired with shaky footage of the moment he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain, while she stood silent, composed. Within minutes, comments poured in. "Disgusting. She handled herself better than I ever could." This is why so many workers don't speak up. What began as one video became dozens. Diners who had hesitated to intervene in the moment now found courage in the safety of their screens. More angles surfaced. Photos, audio snippets, even written accounts of what they had seen. Each one painted the same picture. A powerful man belittling a young black woman who had done nothing wrong. By morning, hashtags were trending. #respect the server. Waitress dignity. Billionaire bullying. The outrage cut across social lines. Service workers shared their own experiences of being demeaned. Customers admitted to watching similar incidents in silence. The story resonated because it wasn't just about one night or one insult. It was about a pattern too familiar to ignore. For every supportive message, there were also the expected defenders. A handful of voices argued that it was just a word, that people were overreacting. But those defenses only fueled the fire. The footage made denial impossible. His tone, his posture, his smirk, it was all there. You could hear the disdain dripping from every syllable. Then came the stories. Hotel staff, past and present, began speaking up. Anonymous accounts popped up, claiming they had worked under his companies and endured similar disrespect. Some recalled being yelled at in meetings. Others remembered moments of public humiliation. A former employee wrote, "He didn't care who you were. If you didn't have money, you were beneath him." It wasn't long before journalists noticed the growing storm. Major outlets picked up the story, embedding the viral video on their sites. The CEO's name, once synonymous with power and luxury, now crawled across headlines next to words like arrogant, disrespectful, and racist. Comment sections overflowed with anger. Readers dissected not only his actions, but the silence of those around him. "Why didn't anyone speak up in that moment?" one comment asked. "Because when money sits at the table, truth rarely has a seat," another replied. As the outrage spread, it became clear that the waitress was no longer alone. Strangers thousands of miles away were speaking her name with respect, applauding the quiet strength she had shown. A single moment of restraint was now being replayed on screens across the country, transforming her silence into a symbol of dignity. Meanwhile, the CEO underestimated the storm. He brushed off early inquiries, issuing no comment when reporters called. He believed the story would fade like so many others. But it didn't fade. It surged. Every hour brought new reposts, new testimonies, new voices demanding accountability. What he thought was a throwaway insult became a firestorm. And that firestorm wasn't just burning online, it was beginning to lick at the edges of his empire. Clients were asking questions, shareholders were growing restless, partners were watching closely. In a world where reputation was currency, his arrogance had become the costliest mistake of his career. But inside the heart of it all was still the waitress. A young woman who had gone to work that night, expecting nothing more than tips and tired feet. She had left the dining room with her head high, unaware that she was about to stand at the center of a storm too powerful to be ignored. The video's wildfire spread was only half the story. What no one outside that dining room yet understood was just how much was at stake. The luxury restaurant where the insult had been delivered wasn't just any restaurant. It was the flagship dining hall of a global hotel chain. And that chain, at that very moment, was locked in final negotiations with the CEO's company for a partnership worth millions of dollars, lion dollars. Board members had chosen that venue to host the dinner for a reason. It was meant to symbolize elegance, confidence, and the kind of prestige that would anchor their collaboration. But instead of being remembered for its chandeliers or fine wine, the night was remembered for a single vicious word that carried across the marble floors. Several members of the hotel's leadership team had been sitting only a few tables away. They didn't need to replay the viral clip. They had witnessed the humiliation firsthand. They had seen the young waitress swallow pain to maintain composure, and they had seen how their high-profile guest reduced her to an object of ridicule. The echoes of that insult sat heavier with them than with anyone else. As the story spread, investors and analysts began connecting the dots. Articles shifted from simply replaying the viral moment to asking deeper questions. How can a man who belittles staff in public be trusted with a partnership that hinges on hospitality and respect? The optics were disastrous. The hotel chain's brand rested on the promise of guest care, of staff treated with dignity, of luxury without cruelty. And here was their potential partner, displayed before millions as the embodiment of everything they claimed to oppose. Emails flew across boardrooms the next morning. One executive wrote bluntly, "If he can't respect a waitress, how will he respect a global partnership?" The concern wasn't just moral, it was financial. A $500 million deal doesn't survive on numbers alone, it survives on trust. Investors knew perception drives profit, and this perception was toxic. Clients would not forgive alignment with arrogance so blatant, so racial in its undertone, so humiliating in its delivery. Meanwhile, the CEO remained convinced of his invincibility. He told colleagues that social media outrage never lasts, that people had short memories. But this wasn't fading. The hashtags kept climbing, the stories kept multiplying, and every hour of his silence made him look guiltier, colder, and more disconnected from reality. The waitress, who had returned home that night with weary steps and a heavy heart, had no idea her dignity had become leverage. She wasn't in those boardrooms. She wasn't reading those frantic investor emails. Yet her quiet strength had shifted the ground beneath a $500 million empire. Behind closed doors, hotel board members debated not just whether to move forward, but how to distance themselves before being dragged into the storm. Some argued to stall negotiations. Others demanded they walk away completely. The deal that had been weeks from signing now teetered on the brink. All because one man couldn't treat a black waitress with basic respect. The irony was cruel and poetic. He had spent years building an empire with ruthless discipline, surrounding himself with strategists who knew how to turn risk into opportunity. But arrogance had blinded him to the simplest truth. In an industry built on service, every server matters. Investors began to pull back. The company's stock faltered, a subtle but telling shift. Analysts on business networks openly questioned his leadership, pointing to the viral clip as evidence of deeper flaws. "Reputation is capital," one remarked, "and this man is bankrupting his." Still, he dismissed the warning signs, leaning into the same arrogance that had created the scandal. He told his closest circle that deals weren't undone by feelings. But he was wrong. Deals were undone by trust, and his had evaporated the moment that word left his lips. The waitress didn't know it yet, but she was no longer just a server in a dining hall. She had become the unspoken center of a storm threatening to unravel one of the largest partnerships in the industry. Her restraint, her dignity, and even her silence had become more powerful than the billions he wielded. And as hotel executives prepared for their next emergency meeting, one fact became undeniable. The insult wasn't just an act of cruelty. It was a turning point. The waitress he dismissed as stupid now held unknowingly the leverage that could cost him everything. By the next morning, the scandal was no longer confined to whispers on social media. It had clawed its way into boardrooms, trading floors, and newsrooms. The clip of the insult was being replayed on every major network, framed with headlines that spelled doom for the billionaire's reputation. Inside the CEO's office, aides scrambled to draft statements. One version called the exchange a misunderstanding. Another blamed stress from negotiations. Yet each draft sounded emptier than the last. The public had already judged, and no string of polished words could erase the sneer on his face when he dismissed the waitress. Then came the leak. Someone inside the hotel forwarded an internal email to reporters. In it, a senior board member wrote bluntly, "If this is how he treats staff in public, imagine what our partnership will look like in private. We cannot align with a man whose arrogance undermines our values." That single email ricocheted through media outlets, setting fire to what little control he had left. Now the story wasn't just about one night in a restaurant. It was about corporate responsibility, about whether billion-dollar companies could afford to ignore racism when it was broadcast so clearly to the world. Investors started calling, their voices sharp, their questions pointed. Stockholders demanded reassurance, but there was none to give. What about the partnership? One asked. How are we supposed to defend this? Another demanded. The silence that followed was answer enough. The hotel chain issued a statement that afternoon. It was only 2 sentences long, but it was devastating. We are aware of the incident involving our guest. We are reviewing all aspects of our pending negotiations and will prioritize the values we stand for: respect, equity, and dignity for all. Translation was unnecessary. The deal was collapsing. Behind closed doors, tempers flared. Some of his own advisors urged him to apologize, to at least acknowledge wrongdoing. But he waved them off. "I won't grovel for something this small," he said, voice dripping with contempt. "It's a waitress. She should be grateful. She even works in a place like that." Those words, meant to reassure his inner circle, revealed the very blindness that had fueled the storm. He couldn't see the waitress as anything more than background, even as she became the focal point of his undoing. Meanwhile, employees from his companies started coming forward. Anonymous posts surfaced, describing years of disrespect, a culture of intimidation, and casual racist remarks that had been brushed aside because of his wealth. Former staffers told journalists about meetings where he belittled junior workers, about the way he dismissed women and minorities with the same sneer now immortalized on video. The picture forming was bigger than one night, bigger than one insult. It was a portrait of a man whose wealth had insulated him from accountability, until now. Business channels that once praised his visionary leadership now hosted panels dissecting his arrogance. Analysts pointed out the irony. The very industry he sought to dominate, hospitality, was built on respect for service. How could a man incapable of showing that respect lead a partnership defined by it? Each hour brought another blow. Clients quietly pulled their accounts, shareholders demanded emergency meetings, partners reconsidered contracts. The empire he had built on intimidation and bravado now trembled under the weight of public outrage. And through it all, the waitress remained silent. She hadn't issued a statement, hadn't given an interview. Yet her face, captured in that moment of restraint, became the symbol of the entire firestorm. She didn't need to speak. Her silence had already spoken louder than his wealth ever could. Humiliation had been loud. Her dignity was still whispering, and the world was listening. The fallout was no longer about whether a single deal would collapse. It was about whether an empire built on arrogance could survive being exposed in such raw, undeniable terms. The answer was becoming clearer by the hour. While executives argued over stock prices and partnerships, the young woman at the center of it all was just trying to breathe through another shift. She hadn't asked for the spotlight. She hadn't chosen to stand at the intersection of dignity and humiliation. All she wanted was to finish her degree, help her mother keep the lights on, and carve out a future where serving tables was only part of her past. That night, after the video spread, her phone lit up with messages she hadn't expected. Friends from school sent screenshots of headlines with her blurred figure in the background. Coworkers whispered that her name was on everyone's lips, even though she hadn't said a word publicly. Some warned her to be careful. Powerful men don't like being embarrassed. Others urged her to stand tall. The world finally saw what you go through every day. At home, her mother sat at the kitchen table, her worn hands folded tightly together. She asked the question that hung between them both. Why did he speak to you that way? There was no answer that could make sense of it. Racism never did make sense. It just cut and left scars that explanations could never close. The waitress tried to shrug it off, but the truth pressed heavy on her chest. This wasn't the first time someone had spoken down to her because of the color of her skin. It wasn't the first time her intelligence had been questioned before she opened her mouth. But it was the first time the whole world was watching. She carried the pain quietly. At work, she smiled for customers, though her jaw ached from holding it. She nodded politely, though her heart pounded each time someone looked at her too long, as if they recognized her from the video. Dignity kept her moving, but it didn't erase the sting. For her family, the humiliation spread far beyond that dining room. Her younger brother, still in high school, came home with clenched fists. "Kids are talking about it," he muttered, ashamed not of her but of the cruelty she'd been forced to endure. He wanted to fight, to defend her. But how do you fight a billionaire? The answer was simple: you don't. You endure. And somehow, enduring became its own form of resistance. Meanwhile, journalists dug deeper. They told her story not as a nameless worker, but as a young woman with dreams, responsibilities, and the weight of survival pressing on her shoulders. They wrote about how many service workers, especially black women, endured daily slights that were rarely caught on camera. They reminded readers that her silence wasn't weakness, it was the courage to keep her dignity intact in a room designed to strip it away. Public support poured in. Messages from strangers thanked her for holding herself with grace. Workers across industries sent notes saying they saw themselves in her. Yet with each new headline, she also felt exposed. She hadn't asked to represent anything larger than herself. And yet here she was, carrying the burden of a nation's outrage on top of her family's struggles. The billionaire, meanwhile, still scoffed at the storm. He could not imagine the weight of what she carried because he had never been forced to carry it himself. For him, humiliation was a press cycle. For her, it was a wound that reopened every time someone replayed the video. And yet, despite the pain, she did not collapse. She rose each morning, laced her shoes, and went back to work. Not because she was untouched by the cruelty, but because resilience was her inheritance. Every step forward was an act of quiet defiance, a refusal to be defined by his insult. This was the part of the story boardrooms could never calculate, the human cost. Behind every headline was a woman swallowing tears so her family wouldn't see her break. Behind every trending hashtag was a brother tightening his fists in the schoolyard. Behind every viral clip was a mother wondering why respect was always too expensive when it came to her daughter. And in that gap between her pain and his arrogance, the stakes of the scandal grew even sharper. Because while he measured loss in dollars, she measured it in dignity. And dignity, once stolen, cannot be replaced. The scandal should have humbled him. It should have forced reflection, even a token apology. But instead, the billionaire CEO did what he had always done. He doubled down. At a press event just days after the video exploded online, he brushed off the controversy with a smirk. "People are exaggerating," he said into the cluster of microphones. "It was a small misunderstanding, nothing more. Frankly, I think the world has bigger problems than one comment at dinner." The words landed like fuel on open flames. Across television screens, his tone reeked of entitlement, his dismissal dripping with the same arrogance captured in the original clip. Viewers shook their heads. Commentators tore into him. "Not only is he unapologetic," one anchor noted, "he's mocking the very idea that respect matters." Social media, already ablaze, erupted all over again. The hashtags multiplied. "Not a misunderstanding," "dignity denied," "no excuse." What had begun as outrage now turned into something deeper, an outright rejection of his authority. People weren't just angry at the insult, they were furious at his refusal to recognize its weight. Shareholders noticed, investors noticed, and, most importantly, the hotel chain noticed. Inside their glass-walled headquarters, executives sat around a long table replaying the press clip in stunned silence. They had hoped, perhaps, that he would make amends, show a glimmer of remorse. Instead, he had dug his own grave. One board member finally broke the silence. "If he won't respect her, he won't respect us. Pull the plug." Behind the scenes, deals that had once been worth millions began to slip through his fingers. A luxury car brand ended its promotional contract. A charity distanced itself from his foundation. Stock values dipped again, each point lost representing not just money, but credibility. His empire was bleeding, and arrogance was the knife. Meanwhile, the waitress continued her shifts, head held high, though her heart still carried the weight of the moment. She hadn't spoken publicly, but her silence only made the contrast starker. On one side was a billionaire with every resource at his disposal, sneering at accountability. On the other was a young black woman, working quietly, embodying the dignity he could never buy. The public saw the divide clearly, and the more he dismissed the scandal, the more people rallied to her side. Fundraisers were organized to help her finish school. Letters poured into the hotel, demanding justice for staff like her. It was no longer just about one waitress. It was about every worker who had ever been demeaned. Every black woman told she was less than. Every insult swallowed because speaking up seemed impossible. For the hotel executives, the decision was no longer difficult. It was necessary. Continuing with the deal would have tied their brand to his arrogance forever. Ending it would cost millions in lost preparation, but protecting their reputation was worth far more. They didn't wait long. Within 48 hours of his press event, the announcement came. Negotiations were suspended indefinitely. Though the statement was polished with corporate language, the message was clear. His behavior had made him too toxic to touch. The fallout rattled the business world. Analysts called it unprecedented. A deal of that scale collapsing not because of numbers, not because of legal barriers, but because of character, or rather, the lack of it. Commentators emphasized the racial undertones. This wasn't just arrogance, one columnist wrote. It was a public humiliation steeped in prejudice, and it cost him millions of dollars lying. The billionaire CEO still didn't grasp the full gravity. He raged privately, blaming cancel culture, blaming the media, blaming anyone but himself. Yet each denial only confirmed what the public already believed. He was incapable of change because he was incapable of seeing beyond his own privilege. For the waitress, the breaking point carried a different meaning. She hadn't asked for a fight, but one had found her. And while he had wealth and headlines, she had something more enduring. The truth of what happened, and the dignity with which she carried it. The story had outgrown the dining room. It had outgrown the clip. It had become a reckoning, A reminder that power without respect was fragile and arrogance could shatter empires faster than any market crash. The breaking point had been reached. But the consequences? They were only just beginning. The scandal had begun as a single moment in a glittering dining room, but by now it had grown into something larger, something that could no longer be contained by one man's arrogance or one company's silence. It was no longer about a glass of wine or a careless insult. It was about the question echoing across the country. How many times does this happen when no one is recording? Workers in restaurants, hotels, and bars started sharing their stories. Black waitresses wrote about being mistaken for janitorial staff, about being ignored, while white colleagues were greeted warmly, about tips withheld because a customer decided they didn't look professional enough. Their stories carried the same sting as the viral clip, proof that the insult wasn't an isolated moment, but a symptom of something much deeper. Advocates pointed to the numbers. Studies showed that black workers in the service industry consistently faced higher levels of verbal abuse and discrimination than their white counterparts. Many reported being overlooked for promotions, punished more harshly for mistakes, or simply treated as invisible. The billionaire's outburst had made headlines, but for thousands, the same prejudice unfolded quietly, day after day, without cameras, without justice. The image of the waitress, standing silent in the face of his sneer, became more than a viral moment. It became a symbol. She represented resilience in the face of systemic disrespect. She embodied every worker who had been demeaned, every woman who had been spoken over, every black employee who had carried the weight of someone else's arrogance and still showed up the next day. Commentators framed the scandal as a lesson. "This is what happens," one journalist wrote, "when power collides with prejudice in a world where people are finally paying attention." Another columnist went further. If he had spoken that way to a man in a suit, the outrage would have been immediate. But because she was a young black waitress, he assumed her silence was permission. He was wrong, and it cost him millions of dollars lying. The public began to demand accountability not just from him, but from the industry itself. How many other corporations allowed similar behavior to go unchecked? How many hotel chains had silenced workers who spoke out? How many boardrooms valued profit so highly they ignored the dignity of the people who made that profit possible? Even politicians weighed in. Some praised the hotel chain for cutting ties. Others condemned the CEO's arrogance as a reflection of deeper problems in corporate culture. The scandal became a talking point on news panels, not as gossip, but as evidence that racism was still embedded in the most ordinary interactions. Ordering dinner, serving drinks, walking through a lobby. And while all of this unfolded, the waitress continued her quiet resistance. She didn't give interviews or make speeches. She went back to work, her presence alone proof that she hadn't been broken. Her silence was not submission, it was strength. She didn't need to explain what had happened, the world had seen it. Humiliation had been loud, but her dignity still whispered, and that whisper was powerful enough to shake boardrooms and topple partnerships. What happened that night revealed a truth too uncomfortable for many. Money cannot shield arrogance from accountability forever. In the past, insults like his were swallowed, forgotten, buried under the weight of silence. But now, silence was no longer guaranteed. Now one clip could ignite a national conversation. The billionaire wanted the story to fade, but instead it forced the country to look at itself. At every restaurant where a server bit their tongue, at every hotel where staff endured slurs to keep their jobs, at every workplace where power excused prejudice. The bigger picture was clear. This wasn't just about him. It was about a system where wealth believed it could buy respect while denying it to others. And the more he tried to dismiss the scandal, the more obvious it became that the real scandal was not one insult, but the culture that allowed it to happen at all. The waitress had become a mirror, reflecting not just his arrogance, but the injustice woven into daily life for millions. And once people saw that reflection, they couldn't look away. The storm that had begun with humiliation was now reshaping into something else: solidarity. Outrage had carried the story across headlines, but what followed was an outpouring of support that the waitress could never have imagined. Her co-workers, many of whom had stayed silent the night of the incident out of fear, began to step forward. "She's one of the hardest working people here," one colleague told reporters. "She didn't deserve that. None of us do." Their words were shared across platforms, painting her not as a victim but as a woman who had been holding dignity on her shoulders long before the world noticed. Community groups began organizing fundraisers, small at first but growing quickly. A scholarship page appeared online with her picture, smiling faintly, apron tied around her waist. Within days, thousands of dollars poured in. Some donors left notes. For every waitress my father disrespected. For my daughter, who's working double shifts just like you. For every black woman told she wasn't enough. The young woman herself remained quiet, but she didn't need to speak. The world had already given her a voice by amplifying her silence. Every repost of the video, every message of support, every dollar raised was proof that people were listening, even when she hadn't asked them to. The hotel chain, under enormous pressure, announced sweeping changes. They promised new protections for staff, stronger anti-discrimination policies, and training for leadership at every level. Cynics called it corporate damage control. But for the staff walking the marble halls and carrying trays through crowded dining rooms, it was a signal that their dignity mattered. The waitress's moment of humiliation had forced the industry to reckon with the humanity of those it too often ignored. Meanwhile, her story inspired others to come forward. Servers across the country posted videos recounting the times they had been insulted, belittled, or underpaid. Many referenced her specifically. If she can stand tall, so can I. Her quiet endurance had rippled outward, giving courage to voices that had long been silenced. The billionaire, of course, saw it differently. To him, the solidarity was proof of what he called mob mentality. He sneered in private meetings, railing against what he described as a witch hunt. But his denial only underscored the contrast between him and the woman he had tried to crush. He had power, but no respect. She had little power, but commanded respect worldwide. The waitress's family felt the shift too. Her younger brother, once angry and ashamed, now walked with a different posture at school. When kids whispered about his sister, he no longer clenched his fists. He smiled. Because while their words carried mockery, he knew the truth. She had stood in the face of arrogance and never bowed. Her mother, who had spent years worrying whether her daughter's sacrifices would ever be enough, now watched as strangers honored her dignity. "You showed them who you are," she said softly one evening. "Not by shouting, not by fighting, just by standing tall." The waitress didn't see herself as a hero. She still worked long hours, still studied late into the night, still worried about rent and tuition. But the world had placed her in a role she could not deny. A symbol of what happens when racism is exposed, when arrogance collides with resilience, and when dignity refuses to bend. What he thought would be her humiliation had become her empowerment. What he thought would fade into silence had become a chorus of support echoing across continents. The power dynamic had shifted. He was still a billionaire, yes, but in the eyes of the public, he was smaller than ever. She, the woman he had dismissed as stupid, had become larger than her own name, larger than that dining room, larger than the insult itself. Her story had become a banner for something bigger, a reminder that racism cannot remain hidden when people choose to see, and dignity cannot be stolen when it is carried with unshakable resolve. The echoes of hope were clear. She had not been silenced. She had been amplified. And the empire that once seemed untouchable was learning the most costly lesson of all, that respect denied to one person can unravel power for all. By now, the story was no longer just headlines. It had seeped into living rooms, office break rooms, classrooms, and kitchens. People were not only watching, they were responding. Letters arrived at the hotel addressed to the waitress, some handwritten, others typed, but all carrying the same message. You are not alone. On social media, the video was stitched into countless reflections. The young server in Chicago posted, "This happened to me last week. Not a billionaire, just a customer with a wallet too heavy and a heart too small. Watching her stand strong reminded me I wasn't crazy, I wasn't weak. It's real, and it's wrong." A grandmother in Georgia tweeted, 50 years ago, they told me to smile when they called me names while I waited tables. I smiled, but I never forgot. Watching her reminds me of my own fight." The waitress, still quiet in the face of the storm, had become a vessel for collective memory. Her silence was filled by the voices of others who finally dared to speak. Commentators on late-night television debated the deeper meaning. One host asked, "Why does it take a viral video for us to believe the experiences of black women in service jobs?" Another answered bluntly, Because we live in a culture that values wealth over truth. Until now, even those who had never worked in hospitality found themselves shaken. Teachers, nurses, retail clerks, people from every corner of the workforce saw their own struggles mirrored in her restraint. The billionaire had insulted one woman, but the world heard him insult thousands. And through the outrage, questions grew louder. How many people watched in silence that night? What if no one had recorded? Why is it always the burden of the humiliated to carry themselves with grace, while the arrogant walk away untouched? The waitress didn't answer those questions herself, but her image did. A still shot from the video, her chin lifted, eyes steady though her lips trembled, circulated like an emblem. It became more than a meme. It became a reminder. Dignity can whisper louder than hate can shout. Churches spoke about her in sermons. Professors assigned the viral clip in discussions on race and labor. Students wrote essays on the power imbalance between billionaire and waitress, employer and worker, black woman and white man. Each retelling pushed the narrative further from scandal and closer to lesson. And then came the children. Parents reported that their kids had seen the video, asked questions, wanted to understand why someone so powerful would act so cruel. The answers weren't easy. But in every conversation, seeds were planted. Seeds of accountability, of awareness, of a demand for something better. Meanwhile, the billionaire's attempts at damage control failed spectacularly. His legal team threatened to sue over defamation, but the video needed no explanation. His words were his undoing. His empire was shrinking, not because of contracts or competitors, but because he had underestimated the power of collective outrage fueled by truth. The waitress didn't need to defend herself. The audience had already done it for her. Her story became a question hanging over the nation. What would you do if you saw it happen? Would you stay silent? Or would you speak? Would you look away? Or would you bear witness? For many, the answers weren't comfortable. Silence had been the easiest choice for diners in the room that night. But now, watching the fallout, they knew silence had been complicity. Racism wasn't just in slurs whispered behind closed doors. It was in the sneer of a man who thought wealth made him untouchable. It was in the nervous laughter of associates who chose loyalty over humanity. It was in the bowed heads of diners who watched and stayed quiet. The audience understood. And because they understood, the story refused to fade. The downfall of a billionaire did not begin in a boardroom, nor in a courtroom. It began in the simplest of places, a restaurant, with one man's arrogance colliding against one woman's quiet strength. What he thought was just another dinner became the undoing of a $500 million empire. A single word, thrown carelessly laced with prejudice, was enough to ignite a movement. He had intended to reduce her, to shrink her to nothing more than an object of his ridicule. But instead, it was he who became small in the eyes of the world. The waitress never shouted. She never fought back with the venom he expected. She stood tall, she poured the wine, she endured. Her silence was not weakness, it was a refusal to let him take from her the one thing he could never buy, dignity. And dignity, whispered softly, brought an empire crashing down. His company's stock slipped, his deals evaporated, partners fled. By the time the hotel chain officially ended negotiations, the damage was irreversible. Millions of dollars lost. Not because of market forces, not because of competitors, but because a powerful man could not summon the most basic form of humanity, respect. He had built his reputation on dominance, on forcing his will onto others. But arrogance has a cost, and racism, even when disguised as a slip of the tongue, carries consequences that no wealth can erase. The waitress, meanwhile, found herself lifted by waves of support. Scholarships, letters, donations, job offers, doors she never expected began to open. She had not asked for this storm, but she had weathered it with grace. And out of that grace grew opportunity. Not only for her, but for others who saw in her a mirror of their own struggle. Her story reminded the world that racism doesn't always scream from headlines. It whispers in restaurants, in boardrooms, in everyday transactions, where one person believes their status gives them the right to demean another. Too often, those moments pass unchallenged, leaving wounds invisible to everyone except the one forced to bear them. But not this time. This time, the insult was caught. This time, the silence of diners was replaced by the noise of millions. This time, the arrogance of one man was answered with the dignity of one woman, and the support of strangers who refused to let her stand alone. It is easy to measure the billionaire's loss in numbers. $500 million gone in the span of a few weeks. But the true cost was far greater. He lost the illusion of untouchability. He lost the shield of silence. He lost the ability to walk into a room and assume that no one would hold him accountable. And for the waitress, her victory wasn't in his downfall. It was in her survival. It was in proving that she could face the weight of prejudice and not bend. It was in showing the world that dignity, carried quietly, can be louder than the sharpest insult. Humiliation is loud. Dignity whispers, and everyone heard it. So now the question turns to us. What do we do when we see racism unfold before our eyes? Do we look away, pretending it isn't our place? Do we laugh nervously to shield ourselves from discomfort? Or do we choose to stand on the side of dignity, even when it costs us? Because this story is not just hers, it belongs to every worker disrespected in silence, every woman belittled in front of others, every black person who has had to carry insult as if it were part of their job. And so I ask you, what would you have done if you had been in that dining room? Would you have lowered your gaze and let the insult pass? Or would you have found the courage to say, enough? Your turn. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever seen someone treated unfairly in public? How did you respond, and what did you learn? And let us know where you're watching from. I love seeing the countries and communities that make up this family. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you reflect, make sure you subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. This channel exists to share real human stories of injustice, resilience, and the power of dignity. He thought his money made him untouchable, but it didn't. He thought one word could define her, but it couldn't. He thought silence meant victory, but silence became her shield and his destruction. Respect costs nothing. Disrespect cost him millions of dollars lying. And when the last headline fades, when the last share has been made, one truth remains. She carried more than plates that night. She carried dignity, she carried history, and she carried a reminder the world will not forget. Dignity cannot be bought, and it cannot be broken. That's where this story ends, but its lesson continues with you. Will you stay silent next time? Or will you add your voice to the whispers of dignity that, together, can topple empires?